Muslims around the world are suffering. From China to Kashmir, to Syria, and Lebanon. And in many other countries. In America, Muslim students struggle to find good schools that are strong in the Islamic knowledge. Help the Association of Islamic Charitable Projects support and strengthen our Muslim communities. Donate generously this Ramadan for the benefit of your Muslim brothers and sisters. Visit gofundme.com/AICP fund.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. We start with the name of Allah. We praise and thank Allah the Exalted for all of the endowments He bestowed upon us, without Allah being obligated to give anything. And we ask Allah to raise the rank of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the ranks of his wives, believing relatives, companions, and those who followed them sincerely until Judgment Day. And we ask Allah to protect the nation of Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam from what the Prophet feared for his nation. Thereafter, previously we talked about the invalidators of the prayer. We went through that list. We talked about the conditions for the rewardability of the prayer, that a person needs to do the prayer for the sake of Allah only, that their food, their clothing, the garments that they wear, and that their prayer surface, the surface that they're praying upon, need to be halal for the rewardability of the prayer, and that one must fear Allah the Exalted, having the reverent fear for Allah by aggrandizing Allah the Exalted in one's heart, even for a moment at least during the prayer, for one to receive the reward in the prayer. And without these three conditions being met, all three of them, then one would not receive reward in their prayer, even if the prayer was valid, meaning that they don't have to repeat it. So if one leaves out even one of the conditions for the rewardability of the prayer, they would receive no reward. Then the Sheikh, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him, he started to talk about the integrals of the prayer. And as we mentioned previously, an integral is a part of the deed that the deed is not valid without. The prayer has 17 integrals according to the counting of some scholars. Some scholars, they counted the integrals one way, and some scholars, they would count the integrals another way. And you would find that in the Shafi'i school, there would be some scholars who they list the same matters, but they would include some as independent integrals, and some scholars, they would include some of those aspects not as their own independent integrals, so then the number would be slightly different. And some scholars mention certain things that were not considered by others as actual integrals of the prayer. Here we're mentioning that the integrals of the prayer are 17. So if one leaves out any one of these matters in the prayer would not be valid. The first of these matters is to have the intention in the heart for performing the prayer and of its obligation if the prayer that one is praying is obligatory. So of course, if one is praying one of the 5 obligatory prayers, one of the 5 daily prayers, then they must have the intention, according to some scholars, that this prayer is obligatory. Likewise, one must specify the particular prayer they're praying if that prayer has a specific time or a specific reason. If it's a prayer that has a certain specific time that's attached to it, then they need to intend that time when they're making their intention. Or if the prayer doesn't have a specific time, but there is a specific reason for that prayer, then the person needs to include that specific reason in their intention. So this intention is among the necessary aspects of the prayer. Of course, the intention is a deed of the heart. It's something that happens in the heart. It's not necessarily of the tongue. So saying the intention with the tongue is not obligatory. Rather, if a person has the intention in their heart, then that would be sufficient. The necessary matter pertaining to the intention is to seek performing the prayer in the heart during the opening saying of Allahu Akbar. And this will come up. This is the second integral, saying Allahu Akbar. This is the second mentioned integral among the integrals of the prayer that the Sheikh will talk about. But the person says or has the intention in the heart while saying Allahu Akbar. It's also obligatory to specify the specific time, like ad-duha. This is an optional prayer. There's an optional prayer called Salatul Duha that occurs after Fajr time is over, after the sun has risen to a certain elevation, and then it lasts till right before Dhuhr prayer. This is called Duha. So this prayer, even though it's optional, it has a specific time. So if a person wants to pray it, then they need to intend that specific time at Duha. Also, one intends the obligation if the prayer is, before that, if the prayer has a specific reason, then they also intend that specific reason. An example of a prayer that has a specific reason is the prayer of the eclipse. All right, there is the prayer of the eclipse. This is a specific optional prayer that the Muslims would pray upon the occurrence of an eclipse. This prayer, it could be very long. It has its own descriptions, and even this is a prayer that one may bow in it twice in one cycle, unlike the 5 obligatory prayers. So in that case, doing 2 bowings in one cycle would not invalidate the prayer, because this is actually among the descriptions of this prayer that came in the religion. However, if a person wanted to pray this prayer, it's not a specific time, rather it's a specific reason, which is the occurrence, the onset of an eclipse. So if a person wants to pray that, then they need to specify in their heart that they are praying the eclipse prayer. So if the prayer has a specific time, they have to include that in the intention. If the prayer has a specific reason, they need to include that in the intention. Also, one intends the obligation if the prayer is obligatory. All of that is obligatory during the saying of Allahu Akbar. That is, in the Shafi'i school, one needs to make all of that, and the intention needs to include all of that while he says Allahu Akbar. He needs to intend to pray this specific prayer and that it's obligatory. And this specific prayer, if it has a specific time or reason, and that it is obligatory. And this does not take long. And for one to establish this intention in the heart does not take long. And establishing the intention does not mean that a person imagines in their mind saying this whole long expression like, I now intend to pray the obligatory Dhuhr prayer, so and so, so on and so forth. And if that was the case, then a person may find it necessary to extend saying the takbirah just to accommodate the length of such a long expression that they're imagining in their mind, they're imagining saying in their mind while they're saying the takbirah. But that's not necessary. Rather, the intention is an aim in the heart for doing something simultaneously associated with the deed. So a person can really say Allahu Akbar and have the intention to do all of those things while in that short duration. It's not necessary for a person to extend saying the takbirah so that they say Allahu Akbar, for example, just to establish the intention, because they felt it necessary for them to imagine saying this long expression in their mind while they are doing the prayer. A person, he conjures in his mind the obligatory Dhuhr prayer. This doesn't take a long time. Then they say Allahu Akbar while that's in their mind, and that will be sufficient for the prayer to be established, for the prayer to commence. So one would have in their mind, I pray the obligatory Dhuhr prayer. And they intend the obligatory Dhuhr prayer, or the obligatory Asr prayer, or Ad-Duha, for example, or the Witr prayer, because these prayers are prayers that have specific times. So the person needs to establish that in their intention, but still it does not take a long time for one to have that in their mind. So they could still say Allahu Akbar in a short way, Allahu Akbar, and still establish all of that in their mind within that duration. Some of the Shafi'i scholars said that the intention of the obligation is not binding. So if a person wanted to pray the obligatory Dhuhr prayer, then for them to merely intend to pray the Dhuhr prayer would be sufficient without adding to that the obligatory Dhuhr prayer. And either for them to just intend the Dhuhr prayer would be sufficient for the validity of the prayer. They have that in their mind, and then while saying Allahu Akbar while standing, and then that prayer would commence, it would be established, and it would be valid to that point. After mentioning the intention, the Sheikh moved on to talk about the integral, the second integral of the prayer, which is to say Allahu Akbar. When one says Allahu Akbar, they need to say it properly. They also need to say it loud enough for one to hear oneself. And this is how every verbal integral of the prayer must be said. Every verbal integral of the prayer has to be said loud enough so that one hears oneself. For example, the takbirah. This is an obligation, this is an integral of the prayer, saying Allahu Akbar. So they need to say it at least loud enough to hear oneself. Likewise, the Fatiha. One needs to say it at least loud enough to hear oneself. However, one is mindful that one does not disturb others during the prayer. So one should not recite the Fatiha in a way that they make others around them hear them. Even the person right next to them, they should not be distracted by the recitation of their neighbor in the prayer, by the one who is next to them in the prayer. So the person who has an issue with that, and they recite in a way that's audible to others, in a way that is disturbing, this is actually prohibited. This is haram. So a person, he enters in the prayer for what? To get reward, to obey Allah the Exalted, not to do something sinful, not to acquire sins. So the person who has an issue with that, let them practice. Let them practice on their own, reciting in a lower voice. And always pray in congregation, not to leave out praying in congregation, saying to oneself, oh, I recite in a loud voice, I will distract other people, so now I'm not going to pray with the people. No, praying in congregation is more rewardable, and it's something that we're encouraged to do in the religion, and actually it is a communal obligation for the congregational prayer to be established in the different towns. So the person, it's good for them, it's beneficial for them, it's rewardable for them, it increases their reward to pray in congregation. So they would practice on their own, lowering their voice in the recitation to the extent where they can say it in a way where if there was no noise, no background sounds, no environmental noise, they would hear themselves, but that those around them would not hear them, not even the one who's standing to either side of them during the prayer, much less those who are standing even further away. So the person, he has to say these things loud enough to hear oneself. Likewise, saying the tashahhud, it must be loud enough to hear oneself. Likewise, saying the salah on the Prophet and the salam, the minimum volume that a person would say these integrals are loud enough to hear oneself. Saying Allahu Akbar is the second integral among the integrals of the prayer. It is a condition not to extend the ba in the word akbar, thus saying akbar. This is prohibited. For one to say akbar in the opening takbirah, this is something that is haram to do. In fact, it would invalidate the prayer. If a person said the opening, instead of saying the opening takbirah properly, they said akbar instead of akbar when you're supposed to say Allahu Akbar, this actually gives a corrupt meaning. The prayer, if a person said that, even if they intended to pray while saying that, the prayer would not commence. It would not start, and it would not be established in the first place. This is because akbar, this word akbar with the extension on the ba, it is the plural of a word in Arabic, kabar. And kabar means a large drum. So akbar means large drums, and it's the plural of large drum. So this term actually has a very corrupt meaning. If a person said Allahu Akbar, he said, if he said it, but instead of saying akbar, he said akbar, and this would mean that Allah is large drums. So that's actually a blasphemous meaning. This is a blasphemous meaning. If the person said it while not understanding the meaning, then that's prohibited and the prayer would not be established. So even if they went through the other actions of the prayer, they wouldn't have actually started praying in the first place, so their prayer would be invalid. If a person knew the meaning of akbar and they said that expression, replacing akbar with akbar, and they said it intentionally, it wasn't like a slip that it came out wrong, then this would actually be blasphemous because it's very clear to you the corruption and the deviance of one saying Allah is big drums. Likewise, it is a condition not to extend the hamza at the beginning of the takbirah. When one says Allahu Akbar, they would not say Allahu Akbar, extending the first letter, the hamza, to make it long, Allah, like this. If they do this, this also changes the meaning, and the prayer would not commence. It would not be established in the first place, so they wouldn't actually have started their prayer. It is understood from this meaning that if a person changed that, thus extending the hamza at the beginning of the name of Allah, this changes the meaning to an inquiry, to a question. So instead of saying Allah is greater than all great ones, instead of carrying that meaning, it would become a question: is Allah greater than all great ones? And this is not valid. Also, it is a condition not to add a wow to the wow letter to before the name of Allah the Exalted. So a person, if he said Wallahu Akbar, likewise his prayer would not commence. Or if he put a wow letter between the name of Allah and Akbar, thus saying Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, this also causes the prayer to not commence. Or if he replaced or this example would be like saying Allahu wa Akbar. And then another example would be to replace the Hamza in Akbar with a waw for a person to say Allahu Akbar. This also would cause the prayer to not commence. So all of these matters are prohibited. If a person did it, then their prayer would not commence. Whether they extended the alif, extended after the ba in Akbar, thus saying Akbar, or if they made an extension in the Hamza before the name of Allah, saying Allah before saying Akbar, or if they put a waw between Allah and Akbar, saying Allahu wa Akbar, or if he changed the Hamza in Akbar to a waw, saying Wakbar, all of these matters, they are invalid and they would cause the prayer to not commence. And a person would be mindful about his tongue, because even if a person initially learned correctly, but if he's not mindful, if he kind of prays on autopilot, if he's not thinking about it much, then a person's tongue may become lazy, and so he doesn't pronounce everything as it should be pronounced necessarily. So then he might find that over time he's saying Wakbar instead of Akbar. He needs to say Allahu Akbar. The Hamza is apparent. Allahu Akbar, not Allahu Akbar. See how it's missing there? So a person would be mindful about that, and they would pay good attention to their own sayings and actions during the prayer. All of this seeking reward from Allah the Exalted. The Sheikh after that mentioned the benefit that if a follower in the prayer was affected by the whispers of the devil for the opening saying of Allahu Akbar, leading him to repeat it in a way that disturbs other followers, it is prohibited for him. That is, he would be sinful for doing that. And as we said, the intention is an aim of the heart that is simultaneously associated with doing with the deed. The person has the intention, it's something easy, and then he says Allahu Akbar, and also the expression Allahu Akbar is generally easy to say. A person would learn it properly from an authority or a qualified teacher, and then he would say it. So he would establish that intention, he would have the presence of the mind, he would know what that means, and then he would say Allahu Akbar, and that's it. Without allowing himself to fall victim to the whispers of the shaitan and that say to him, you didn't establish the intention on time, the intention wasn't correct. No, a person knows well and he's focused when he does that, and so he performs this without hardship, without a difficulty, and then he would enter into his prayer and he would complete the prayer in the same way. The prayer is something that the Muslims resort to in hard times, and they find comfort in it and some release and like this. And it's an act in which a person can humble themselves to their Lord in a great way. It's an excellent and awesome act of worship. It's the most important act of worship after the belief in Allah and His Messenger. Performing the obligatory prayers is the most important act of worship after the belief in Allah, the Exalted, and His Messenger. So the person wouldn't allow the shaitan to ruin that for him by making it as if it's a burden on him or a hardship. No, the person takes the reins in his situation. He does that by learning the matters of the religion from an authentic chain, learning that from a qualified teacher. He acquires the details that he needs to be able to perform that correctly. He has the presence of mind and focus when he does that with seriousness. And he takes the steps that the Prophet ﷺ encouraged to protect oneself from the devil. All right, and having the presence of mind in these acts is very important in that. It helps and is very important in that. May Allah Ta'ala protect us from the harm of the devil. Then the Sheikh mentioned the third integral of the prayer after mentioning having the intention and saying Allahu Akbar during the while having the intention in one's heart. The third integral of the prayer is for one to stand for the obligatory prayer if able. Yani when one is able to stand, they are obligated to stand for the obligatory prayer. He said that this is obligatory whether one was praying one of the 5 obligatory prayers, or even if one was praying to fulfill a vow or to pray the funeral prayer. And you may know that the funeral prayer, all it has is standing of positions. There is no bowing and there is no prostration. Thus, it is a condition for the validity of the prayer of the child, just as it is a condition for the validity, or it is this is an integral. He said it is an integral for the validity of the prayer of the child, just as it is an integral for the validity of the prayer of the adult. Meaning that the mentally discriminate child, who, because he's mentally discriminate, he's reached a state in which he is permitted to pray. He can do these acts of worship for himself. Even though he's a child, if he's going to pray one of the 5 prayers, for example, one of the 5 prayers, or the funeral prayer, he still needs to stand. As for the optional prayers, you may know that the person is not obligated to stand. Rather, they are permitted to sit, even if they're able to stand, and they are permitted to lay, even if they are able to sit or stand. But that's the optional prayers. As for the obligatory prayer, the person has to pray. He said, even if it's a vow, because a person may vow to pray an optional prayer. The prayer, its original judgment is that it's optional. So, in the optional prayer, the person is permitted to sit or lay. But once the person vowed to do it, like saying, Lillahi alayya an usalliya salatan, for example, he's used the format of a vow to take it upon himself to do this optional act of worship, but religiously, because he made it a vow, it becomes obligatory upon him to perform. So now that this prayer is obligatory because it's a vow, he is obligated to stand when he performs it, because you have to stand for the obligatory prayer. He said if one was unable to stand on his own or with assistance, because if a person can stand with assistance, then he still has to stand. But if one was unable to do that, by being afflicted with a severe hardship that is not normally bearable, his prayer is valid while sitting. And in this situation, the person can sit in the prayer. In this scenario, the sitter's bowing is by the head being parallel to the knees. What is best is for the head to be above the place of sujood on the prayer surface. So the person, for example, if he's sitting, then he still needs to do what? Ruku' while he prays. So his ruku' would be for him to put his head above, to lean forward, to put his head above his knees, and that it's even better for him to lean enough so that his head would be over the place where he's going to put his head down for sujood without actually making sujood. And then he would sit back up for al-i'tidal, for the returning to the position that came before the bowing. And then he can prostrate. He can actually prostrate, do the actual prostration when it's time to prostrate. He's sitting on the floor, for example. And so then he actually does the actual act of prostration when it's time for that. He said, if one is unable to sit, it is obligatory for him to pray the obligatory prayer laying on one side. So he would pray on one side or the other. It is better to lay on the right side and disliked to lay on the left side without an excuse. But he didn't say invalid. It's better for one to lay on the right side, facing the Qibla. He lays on the right side. All right. But if he laid on the left side, that would be valid, but it's better not to. It's recommended not to. He would be rewardable. It would be rewardable for him to abandon that. He said, If unable to pray on one side, it is obligatory to pray laying on one's back. It is obligatory to raise one's head in the front of one's chest, even a little bit, to direct his face towards the Qibla. So one would lay on his back, but he would lift somewhat so that he wouldn't be laying all the way on his back facing the sky. He said because if he doesn't do that, he would be facing the sky, thus his prayer would be invalid. If he's unable to raise his head, he suffices with directing the arches of his feet towards the Qibla. Yani, the person has a foot, and then there's that part of the foot that doesn't touch the ground when a person's whole foot is on the ground. There's a part of the foot that's lifted, that's between the ball of the foot and the heel, on the inner side of the foot, not the outer side of the foot, and the inner side where the 2 feet would meet, the inner side of the feet. There's a part there between the ball of the foot and the heel where there's a slight raising for the person who's not flat-footed. So the person would aim that part of the foot towards the Qibla. If one is unable to do all of that, like only being able to lay on his belly, he prays as such and raises his head if able, and gestures with the head for bowing, and gestures lower for sujood. If one was unable to move his head, he prays with his eyelids, moving them with the intention of bowing, and then with the intention of sujood. He would lower his eyelids to bow, and he will lower them more so to make sujood. He will lower his eyelids to bow, then he will lower his eyelids even more to perform sujood. Thus, closing the eyes is not valid for the gesturing that would stand for bowing. One does not close the eyes all the way for the gesturing that is in the place of the bowing, because the gesture that has to be for sujood should be more than the gesture that is for the bowing. So if a person closes his eyes for the bowing, he can't close his eyes more for the sujood. So he wouldn't do that. He wouldn't close his eyes for the gesture for bowing. The Sheikh said that if a person was powerless to do all of that, he couldn't perform any of these things. He couldn't sit. He couldn't lay. He couldn't lay on his back. He couldn't lift himself. He couldn't lay on his front. He couldn't move his head. He couldn't move his eyes. He performs the integrals of the prayer in his mind. As for the verbal integrals, he says them. If his tongue was tied, meaning he's unable to recite, he recites them in his mind as well. Furthermore, a condition for the standing is resting on one's feet. If a person is standing for the prayer, then he needs to stand resting on one's feet and straightening one's spine. However, it is not obligatory to straighten one's neck. In fact, it is recommended to lower one's neck forward a little. And so this is actually sunnah. It's better for one to lower their neck a little bit. They do not have to straighten their neck as straight as their back would be. The Sheikh mentioned a benefit. He said placing the hands below the chest and above the navel is recommended after the opening saying of Allahu Akbar. So he would put the right hand over the left and have the hands below the chest but be above the navel. This is according to the school of Imam al-Shafi'i. Some scholars have different sayings about exactly where the hands would be placed. So don't be too surprised if you see some people having their hands a little lower. As for the placing of hands on one side, the Sheikh said that there is no root for this in the religious text, because you may see some people just standing there with their hands to their side. The Sheikh said that there's no hadith or Quranic verse that indicates this. There's no root for that in the religion. So it doesn't invalidate one's prayer if they stood like that with their hands to their side, but this is not something that was conveyed from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And with that, we've completed mentioning 3 of the 17 integrals of the prayer. The Sheikh will go into some detail about some of these things, but I feel that some of these details are appropriate to be mentioned in this session. So we will go into some details, not all of the details. May Allah the Exalted guide us to the acceptable deeds, guide us to be among those who learn the correct knowledge and an abundance of it, and implement it ourselves and teach it to others, so that we would be like the inheritors of the prophets who are the scholars. May Allah the Exalted give me a good ending and you as well. Walhamdulillah wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. La ilaha illallah. Allahumma salli ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Rabbi ighfir li wa lil mu'minina wal mu'minat. Jazallahu Muhammadan 'anna khayra. Assalamu alaykum wa rahmatullah.
قلوبنا هامت بذكر الله 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 الله. قلوبنا هامت بذكر الله 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 الله. قلوبنا هامت بذكر الله 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 الله. قلوبنا.
Muslims around the world are suffering. From China to Kashmir, to Syria, and Lebanon. And in many other countries. In America, Muslim students struggle to find good schools that are strong in the Islamic knowledge.
أنزلت يا محمد تعلم التوحيد لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله.
Help the Association of Islamic Charitable Projects support and strengthen our Muslim communities. Donate generously this Ramadan for the benefit of your Muslim brothers and sisters. Visit gofundme.com/AICP Fund.